Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2.
Chapter 7.
A pair of flitting birds bounced between the branches of neighboring trees within the copse of dense foliage, musing on the surroundings with their respective melodies. The song, a beautiful cadence of highs and low pitches, was made spectacular with the accompaniment of the bird's mate. Barriss found it enchanting in its own way, as she washed the remainder of the thick mud from her robe. Standing ankle-deep in the crystal-clear water, Barriss had cast her boots to dry on the small river shore, after scraping, then washing the mud off of them as best she could. Satisfied that much of her garment was clean to her liking, she dipped her hands into the water again to scoop some into her mouth. The water was cool as it washed down her throat, a purity that stood wonders above the filtered liquid she had grown so used to, and a marvel as it washed the remainder of the tuber root fibers from her teeth and mouth. The peace surrounding her was impeccably intoxicating, the warm late morning breeze gently penetrating the dense, colorful foliage with its sweet, provocative scents. The enchanting melodies of the colorful birds echoing through the trees only added to the captivating scene about her, solidifying her earlier sentiment that she had never been to a more beautiful place. For the fourth time, her mind trailed off to thoughts of her research, the endless hours of holo images and data feeds, accounts from intrepid explorers, and those from individuals looking for lost knowledge. Her confusion wore on her consciousness as her immediate reality varied immensely from the vast amount of information on this locale provided to her directly by Sidious. Had the man not bothered to even look here for himself? And if so, why not provide her with anything close to valid? Yes, if she remembered correctly, she had a destination. But would that be any different than her current location? Would it too present itself differently to her, as this place clearly was? She looked down at her toes, watching as the clear water refracted the vision of her bare feet upon the brown and black stones at the river's bottom. In contrast, her olive skin appeared a deep green and black of their own. The inference within that moment was not lost on her. Knowledge and perception can sometimes be at odds, despite our best efforts to marry the two into a cohesive thought. Jedi Master Kens Dumar's remarks regarding the Penslock psychological theory of perception could not have been applied to a better scenario had Barriss scripted it herself. That thought born to her memory of sessions with the former Jedi was only a testament to her surroundings, conjugated with her abilities of sensitive recall. She could sense something was not as it seemed, birthing the memory of the statement, a defensive ability that had in the past served her incredibly well. She could not take her eyes off the refracting water as it raced around her firmly planted feet. She focused on the gurgling sound of the water at her ankles. The sound became almost overbearing as it began to echo through the small opening within the thicket of vegetation. She drew her attention away from it and onto the lack of sound elsewhere. It gave her pause. She cleared her thoughts and turned her gaze toward Eerie and Quinn. The enormous fronds of variegated greenery limited her view, but she could see that they too had sensed something was amiss. The breeze parted the ferns gently, and she noticed the buzzing and humming of 1,000 of insects had ceased completely, the wind bringing a slight scent of decay. She tossed her head in the other direction, observing that the pleasing melodies being sung by the duo of birds had also ceased. She noiselessly pulled her feet from the river's bottom and began to pad toward the shoreline nearest Eerie, careful not to lose eye contact with the beast. The breeze riled up the fronds again, and the same cloying scent of decay came with it, a sickly sweet mixture of old meat and the metallic tang of drying blood. Barriss picked up her pace while remaining as quiet as possible, pushing past the massive ferns without a sound. Entering the thicket, Eerie turned its gaze upon Barriss. She felt a sense of heightened awareness to protect herself, and without thinking, Barriss vocalized a short, high-pitched yelp, getting Quinn's attention as intended. When both thumpers were staring at her, she motioned them to lie down with both hands. She mimicked the action by crouching low. Barriss had assumed there would be predators, but was also completely out of her element and found herself resorting to base instinct. She was pleased to see both animals lowering themselves to the ground instead of bolting mindlessly like she assumed they would. Barriss continued walking cautiously toward them, her bare feet squishing through the muck that had proven to be such an impediment earlier. Finding that she would make no sound by deliberately dipping her toes first and then transferring her weight to the balls of her heels, she took the opportunity to focus her senses completely on scent and sound. Closing her eyes, Barriss continued forward, guided by the scents on the breeze. She could distinctly smell the difference between both thumpers, the fresh scent of the flourishing life around her, and an almost inaudible growl from beyond the grass line. She reached both thumpers and stretched a hand toward both of their heads, forcing them lower to the ground, grasping the hilt of both lightsabers when she rose back to her feet. She opened her eyes and let them feel the void she had painted mentally. The growl was 4 meters in front of her, her eyes doing their best to look past the dense blades of grass without success. The growling ceased suddenly, and she knew what was about to transpire would wait no longer. Barriss lowered herself as far as possible to the grass-lined mud while maintaining her balance, her arms outstretched and her sabers at the ready. She felt the lunge before she saw it, heard it before it happened, and was patiently waiting for the enormous feline to crest the arc of its leap. The sun's brilliance dazzled her for a split second as it glistened off the creamy white coat of the feline projectile, but her attention was immediately drawn to the massive paws and finger-length claws protruding from them. By drawing herself and her companions to the ground, she had negated the target zone as the creature had intended, and it soared 2 feet above her head, landing silently behind her in the looming mud. Barriss raised herself and turned quickly to face the beast, ensuring she was between it and the thumpers. She took a second to watch the feline as it corrected its gait and regained its footing, front paws sloughing noiselessly to escape the ground's grasp on them. Within seconds, the animal had stabilized itself and with its paws spread wide, lowered its head and glowered at her. A deep, resonant rumble escaped its maw, a growl she felt through the ground. Its eyes locked on hers, a sparkling shade of light blue that seemed to tear right into her soul. In response, her lips curved into a small smile as she adopted a defensive stance with both sabers. Barriss watched a ripple of muscle quiver through its sinewy shoulders as it lowered its head even more, its claws digging into the mud with anticipation. "You're beautiful," she thought, finding it difficult to deny that truth to herself. The color blend from belly to spine matched the foliage and vegetation around them precisely. A shock of severe white lined its back, from its spine, from its massive head to the base of its tail. Sensing the feline's next action swiftly approaching, Barriss set her footing and ignited both sabers. They sprang to life in her hands with a sharp crack and hiss of super-concentrated energy, shrouding her aura in their red glow. But just as quickly and quite unexpectedly, they extinguished themselves with a sputtering lament. For the first time in a very long time, Barriss felt a twinge of fear. She felt defenseless, useless, and vulnerable, a raw nakedness in the face of natural order. She was no different than the smallest insects waiting to be consumed by something bigger. It was only for a moment, and she shook her head back to rational thought, wondering briefly what had brought on that spasm of weakness. The beast was preparing to pounce again, after resetting its footing, a wave of bewilderment splashing in its eyes in the wake of Barriss's extinguished sabers. Barriss tossed the sabers aside and brought her hands in front of her, ushering in the force. She was astounded when it immediately responded, flooding her with intensely focused power, the likes of which she had never experienced. The feline moved and extended its claws for her throat before its hind legs left the ground. Barriss narrowed her eyes and put every ounce of energy she possessed into a massive force wave, stripping the grasses bare before her and blowing them back to their breaking points at her sides. The wave peeled the enormous, colorful fronds of vegetation from their stalks and blew birds from the trees, insects and rodents from their hiding places, but it only managed to halt the giant cat back into its original stance. The pangs of fear rose again, rattling her. The force energy had extended with a blast that should have flayed the hide from the feline's bones, yet it stood unharmed, almost mocking her. Suddenly, left in the wake of Barriss's force wave, a haze of undecipherable, deafening whispers corrupted the silence. It was a chorus of chanting, spoken in dozens of dialects crossed over one another, creating an audio nightmare in her mind. She could hear male and female voices, old and young. They came hurried, some feverish and angry, others sincere, unreserved. In an attempt to shout out the noise, Barriss clapped her hands to her ears and fell to her knees in the mire below her, squishing mud around her calves and ankles. She could feel something wet on her fingertips and pulled her hands away from her ears to see tiny drops of blood. Let go of what you think you know and embrace your strength, young one. A singular whisper rang clearly through the chaotic orchestra. It was unhurried and deliberate, meant to break down the cadence of chanting as it softened those whispers with every syllable. The voice was female, with a subtle charm hinting at a deeper intelligence and even deeper wisdom, although neither of which Barriss could place. She felt a sudden urge to surrender to her fear completely, submit to its whim and cower behind Quinn, but her heart would not allow it. She knew she could overcome a simpler predator on these plains, even if her sabers refused to respond or the force was useless against this beast. Despite the suddenness of the voice, she abated any thought of divining its source for the moment and let her heart guide her actions toward the truth the voice had observed. Embrace my strength. From her prone position, naked save the simple black tunic wrapped around her body, she locked gazes with the feline that lowered over her, its steel blue eyes seeming to cut into her very being. Barriss cocked her head to the right and planted a thought into the cat's mind. It immediately responded by backing off, relaxing its muscles and staring back at her without the glaring clarity they had just possessed. She twisted the suggestion into an irritation, and the feline responded with a massive shake of its head that bobbed up and down as if to break free of something that it could only sense or see. Barriss forged the irritation into an annoyance, watching again as the cat responded with its paws in front of its snout, swatting at the air before it. She then shaped that annoyance into a vision. The beast turned to bolt away from her with an uneven growl, its claws retracting back into its paws to enable a swift escape. In turn, Barriss escalated the vision into a nightmare. The cat pawed at the ground with each leg independent of the other, as if it were stuck in mud, its eyes betraying its instincts and reflecting fear. The irregular growls slowly turned into whimpers and juvenile mews. The cat projected outright dread as those simple calls turned into horrific moans and its eyes snapped open as far as they dared. She watched as the animal began to surrender to its fear completely, bobbing its head ever higher to avoid being swallowed by the mud it thought it was sinking into. Although she knew she could amplify the effects, she held back, watching, waiting. When the cat succumbed to its fate, it lowered its head one last time, and she watched its chest widen as it sucked in all the air it could into its lungs. Quinn had gotten up and was pacing around the feline through its death throes, looking at it with intense curiosity. Barriss felt that the thumper knew what was happening but was wordless to explain how. Quinn looked to Barriss suddenly, lowering his head slightly, blinking his eyes slowly. The look was solemn and filled with peace. She could not explain the sudden wave of sentiment that washed over her, accompanying his expression, feeling his compassion for the feline. Eerie, too, had shifted her body toward Barriss and pushed her muzzle under her right hand. Barriss could sense the same emotion emanating from her touch and felt the unspoken mercy they were trying to convey. Mercy, Barriss thought. I haven't experienced much of that myself, so I may be a bit out of practice. She spoke to the embattled feline before her. Barriss blew out her breath and released the beast from her mental suggestions. The cat, almost unconscious, fell to its belly in a heap. It gasped aloud repeatedly, sucking in enormous draughts of air in the process. Quinn watched as he hovered above the animal, and seemed to exude pride as he turned to Barriss, covering the short distance and lying down to her left. All three watched as the cat began to normalize its breathing, but it hadn't moved a muscle otherwise. Its huge head lolled to the side lazily. Barriss noticed that the cat had yet to open its eyes. Mercy, she stated, patting the heads of both thumpers. Both let a ripple of a purr course through their bodies, whether a product of her actions or simply her touch. She was uncertain, yet the peace emanating from the two was powerful, she had to admit. She realized then that despite their earlier conception, they had not exhibited any level of fear throughout her actions. Even with the glance through the trees when they had first made eye contact, Barriss had only interpreted concern, never fear. Curious. She mouthed the word as she looked up again toward the feline. Certain that she would have allowed the animal to die, kill itself by all rights, as it would have denied itself the air to breathe. She had kindled another thought while stroking the fur of the thumpers. She pulled herself from the muck, her legs freeing themselves with a sucking sound, and strolled to the feline. Its eyes remained closed, but it turned its head slowly in her direction as she approached, clearly in no position to offer any resistance. Tentatively, she placed her hand on the cat's head, carefully watching as it pulled back its ears and rumbled a slight growl she felt through its sinewy muscles. As she stroked the cat's soft fur, its ears righted themselves within seconds. The warning rumble and the growl subsided to a pensive purr. Barriss could feel the tension leave the animal completely as it gave itself to her whims, forcing its head deeper into her fingertips. The thought of companions of any sort felt awkward to Barriss, a responsibility in and of itself that she had never made the time for. It was only her, and it had only been her for as long as she could remember. Thoughts of Luminara sped through her mind, of Ahsoka, of Jedi Master Shaktai. People she had felt were companions, even friends, she supposed, but that was a lifetime ago, in another age entirely. She had made it a point to differentiate that life from her current one when the Emperor had approached her years prior, freeing her from detainment. Since that it had only been herself, she looked at all three of the animals surrounding her, thinking through the irony. At least you don't talk back. That would prove unbearable, she said to all of them with a slight eye roll. Barriss looked off toward Tirnaval, far to the east, and as the breeze picked up again, sending a slight chill through her, carrying her loose hair in straight and wavy strands past her face. She never wore her hair like this, and the wisp tickled her face. She tucked them behind her ears. She had always pulled her hair back in some severe manner to keep it out of the way, and she maintained its length out of defiance to any who had suggested she trim it. Barriss began to ponder the voices that had assailed her earlier, when she had felt the feline stomach churn under her hand. Turning her attention directly to the immediate, she knew the cat was hungry, and nothing more. Its intentions were not sinister. It only did what it does, a predilection concurrent with a natural order. She understood precisely why Quinn and Eerie had appealed for mercy. Death was a sentence that would have gone against that natural order. She too knew that truth, while trying to convince herself at that moment she didn't care. Her heart, however, would never forget. A loud thwomp broke her concentration, and Barriss spun around to see Quinn picking a smashed rodent from the ground with its teeth. Its neck snapped from the impact of the thumper's strong tail. He had a torn ear gently pinched in his jaw and walked it over to the languishing feline, dropping it before the cat's mouth. So much for subtlety, she thought. What happened to mercy? She asked Quinn, understanding that the two instances were nowhere near the same. He only nodded in her direction and dropped his body at Eerie's side with a mild hoot. She turned her gaze to the cat, more directly at its mouth, to see if there was any reaction to the food that had been placed before it. It opened its eyes slightly and sniffed at the offering, and then devoured it faster than Barriss could blink. It swallowed it whole. She shook her head, chuckling, knowing it would take a valley full of rodents to keep him fed. Eerie's rhythmic breathing assured Barriss that the thumper was sleeping. Quinn, too, closed its eyes and prepared for a nap as well. On her way back from the river's edge, her boots under her arm, she gazed back at the feline, noticing that it was also napping, the heat of the day away. The sounds of the valley had returned to normal. The insects continued their orchestrations, and the birds resumed their chorus. Several sounds she hadn't noticed earlier were present, like the high-pitched screeching that was picking up in intensity. She thought again of the whispering chanting and overlapping voices earlier, and how their crescendo had caused her ears to bleed. She had been subject to many oddities over the years, but the soft, harmonious voice that spoke clearly to her was the most profound. She instinctively knew who it belonged to, but it was beyond belief. There should be no way for that to be possible. "You know who I am." The voice chimed in her head again. Barriss, for reasons beyond her understanding now, was not surprised. "I do," she replied. "I am here to seek your guidance, Zana."